Along with the Sooners, we are working toward April 22nd and the spring game right here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you all being here. OU Sooners Live. You know the deal. You ultimately produce the show. So leave the comments and questions there in the live chat. Consider the super chat, which helps build the channel. Jason Ray's here to answer your questions and talk some college football with you. As always, catch Jason's work as well. In addition here, he's done a couple softball shows for us. This weekend, is that an LSU series or was that a single game against LSU?
It was a single game last night. And Oklahoma won 3-0. So then they have a kind of an off week in terms of their conference play this weekend. They have a tournament at Miami of Ohio, but it was a good win last night for them. Always no matter the sport, whether it's baseball, softball, even basketball or football, LSU's always a tough place to play, and it's no different from a softball perspective. So it was a good win for them last night.
For sure. A good win on the recruiting trail last weekend, and this was just after Jason and I got done with the live stream last. Michael Hawkins, top 25 quarterback in the country, out of McKinney, Texas, has chosen Oklahoma. He's at 6 feet, 6'2.5", 195. And your thoughts about Mr. Hawkins?
Yeah, Mark, I think this was a guy that most folks inside the inside the know, so to speak, from a recruiting perspective, thought that this was a fairly heavy lean to Oklahoma over the last few weeks, and especially like the last month or two. He's a guy that, and we'd mentioned this on Saturday, he's a guy that was he's closer to TCU from a proximity perspective, but had consistently been at OU through some of the spring practices and stuff, and had made about 6 or 7 different visits to Oklahoma while only making a couple to TCU. So I think there was a lot of confidence that he would give his pledge to Oklahoma. And then earlier, and you'd mentioned the name, and again, it's escaped me, but TCU got a pledge from another quarterback from Allen, Texas, previously last week. So I think with both of those things, there was the writing on the wall. So absolutely, this is a kid out of, as you mentioned, out of McKinney, Texas, dual threat guy, number 19 overall quarterback in the country. Has super big time upside. And I think as these things typically happen with some of the big schools, blue bloods, once this guy or another guy is a little bit lower on the totem pole, but then once they commit to a school, like if it's Oklahoma or Ohio State or Georgia or Alabama, they tend to shoot up the rankings just a bit in their senior season. So we'll see how that goes. But no, I mean, I think he's got a good upside, really big, really good dual threat for Oklahoma. Obviously at 195, we'll probably need to put on some weight a little bit at that quarterback position. But no, I think it's certainly a good guy, a good get for Oklahoma. And I think remains to be seen. I've heard some thoughts that potentially Oklahoma could take a couple quarterbacks in the 2024 cycle. I think with what Oklahoma has from a depth perspective here this year, we'll see how that continues to pan out throughout the season at the end of the season. But yeah, I think certainly got Hawkins, and it'll remain to be seen if they go with another guy. But Oklahoma's typically, and I don't know if that strategy will change with Venables and Levy, but over the last few years, the strategy has been to get at least one quarterback in every class and not necessarily get a couple. But we'll see how that continues to go through this recruiting cycle.
Michael Hawkins came out of the gate in game number 1 of his junior season and had a rough go with 101 yards passing and 2 picks and a 52-14 loss. And then he caught his stride and started to put up big numbers throughout the season. His team did lose 3 of its final 4 games and a couple blowouts there. So I don't know how good, of course, the team around him was. They went 7-4, which is a decent record, but not typically what you see out of these top-notch quarterbacks. They usually lead very highly rated teams, but he completed 56% of his passes 2,000 yards, about 184 yards per game, 20 touchdowns, 5 picks. So a good TD to pick ratio despite the opener not going too well for him. Again, Michael Hawkins to OU at quarterback. Comments and questions, folks. We will take them on here at the Voice of College Football. We have gone through the positions each and every week with Jason. We are done with the offense. So if you want to check out the earlier posts, and keep in mind that we are no longer, at least at this point, editing these down to individual segments, but I do provide a timestamp list of where you can find your favorite topics. So check out the previous live segments and the individual segments from last month that have our breakdown: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, offensive line. And we're going to hit the D line this week. And Brent Venables went out and got quite a few guys here in this 2023 class that may or may not factor in, of course, this year. Then, of course, hit the transfer portal for 3 either interior or edge guys along the defensive front.
Yeah, Mark, and I think before I done a little bit of I'm big on the analytics side, and I'm big on the statistical side of things. So I think it's important to know, and I think a lot of people know this, but you can kind of skew some of the statistics in really any direction that you want to take them, right? But I think this is unfortunately for Oklahoma, coming off the heels of one of the worst defenses probably in program history, and so the one thing that Oklahoma was pretty solid at is tackles for loss per game. They did a really good job at that. Had ranked number 5 in the country with 8 tackles per loss. But when you go down the gamut, the numbers are, and that's about the only really solid thing from a statistical perspective. When you look at sacks, Oklahoma was number 64 in the country. Rushing defense, 106th ranked team in the country. Total defense, 122 out of 131. Scoring defense, 99 out of 131. Passing defense, 119th out of 131. Red zone defense, 88th out of 131. Third down conversions, again, 88 out of 131. So you say that and go through those statistics, and it's, I think, as an Oklahoma fan, as many people are that watch these, it's kind of hard to probably digest those, and Oklahoma being so far down the list, and all of those major defensive statistical categories. But I say that to say on one side, we talked about this to a certain degree, but last week as we kind of teased the defensive position breakdown that we're going to do over the next few weeks, but there's not a whole lot where else to go but up. I think that it's hard to imagine that it could potentially be the same or get any worse. But I think at the same time, Mark, what Venables had said and some of the staff has kind of echoed that the commentary related to Oklahoma being on a different planet defensively this year. And so I think that obviously that remains to be seen, how much better they can be. I think that there's a lot of trends that would make you think that this team has an opportunity to be quite a bit better than they were last year. You get year 2 in the system. You've got over the last couple of years, you've got a pretty decent recruiting, a recruiting update issue, if you will, on how they've recruited some of these kids, and so athleticism is there. But this does have an opportunity. I'm not saying that it will necessarily show itself on the field, but I think there's a lot of optimism and excitement within the program that this does have an opportunity to be a much better defense. I myself I'm really a wait and see type of person. You hear this from time to time through the spring. How much better this team's going to be, and this person, blah blah. But I think you kind of have to watch, and especially after what happened last year against Nebraska, then it kind of went south after that. But the point that you made, Mark, to start, absolutely, Oklahoma went into the portal and got 4 guys among the defensive line. that are going to be expected to help them in some capacity this year. Trace Ford came over from Oklahoma State. Jacob Lacey came over from Notre Dame. Rondell Bothroyd came over from Wake Forest, and then Davon Sears came over from Texas State. So when you look at those four, when you really just kind of break down those four, and I know I said those pretty quickly, Mark, but I think the guy that a lot of people had a lot of high hopes for coming in, and I think a lot of people have seen already through spring practice, is Rondell Bothroyd is a guy who comes fairly polished, has been has been a really good player among the defensive line for Wake Forest over the last couple of years. And honestly, Mark, he's a guy that came to Oklahoma because he wanted to have an opportunity in one last season to bolster his draft status. He's a guy that probably could have went out this year and been a fairly high draft pick, but wanted to have the opportunity under Todd Bates, wanted to have the opportunity under Brent Venables to really showcase his talents and really be coached maybe to a different level than he felt like he was coached at Wake Forest, and not necessarily any kind of a shot at Wake Forest without a doubt, but just just what those two coaches have, and so I think he's shown himself really early on, Mark, to be a professional in every way, shape, and form. The way he approaches practice, the way he approaches the weight room, how he interacts with some of the other kids and things like that as a redshirt senior, I should say. So really a lot of good things that you would expect out of him, Mark, from from pressuring the quarterback and tackles for loss, and really just overall, I think they'll move him around a little bit, play him a little bit of play him in the inside as well. And when you look at those the other ones, Trace Ford coming over from Oklahoma State, he's a guy that played a lot early on in his career, didn't really necessarily play as much over the last couple of years just because of injury situations, and so and he's still he's still nursing some of those injuries, so he's not anywhere near 100%, and I don't think he's really even participated a ton early on in spring ball. So, but he's a guy that if he gets healthy, is very capable of being a disruptor among that defensive line. Jacob Lacey's another kid. Will play inside from Notre Dame, and from all indications, he's very much a student of the game. He was very highly recruited coming into Notre Dame. Todd Bates even talked a little bit about that in terms of when he was at Clemson, really, really targeted him from a recruitment perspective. Obviously ended up going to Notre Dame, and talked about how this was a, kind of a seamless transition for him, for Todd Bates, in terms of Jacob Lacey was the first guy that he called when he hit the when Lacey hit the transfer portal. So a guy that he likes and certainly should be in the mix this year as well. And then Davon Sears is the one that's probably, Mark, a little bit of a wild card, just in terms of the transfers. Played certainly has been very, very impactful with Texas State over the last few years, as you have here, 3.5 tackles for loss and a sack last year. Obviously still learning the system, as is all the other transfers, Mark, but I think he's the guy that we'll see how that transitions for him, in terms of how big of a impact that he's going to be able to make. But then when you look, I think overall, I think at the defensive line, I think, as you look at the personnel here, I think the one thing that really struck me is this team has 11 seniors among the defensive line. So whether that be some of the transfers that we've mentioned, or seniors that had been with the program for the last few years, so there is a certain degree of experience that this team has among the defensive line. So I think that was something that really just popped out at me, I should say, that is something that I didn't really kind of remember, I think, that in terms of being that senior laden. But then when you look at some of these, you'd mentioned as well some freshmen. that came in. I think the one that's gonna I think that's going to resonate with most people is PJ Edibari, one of the best defensive line recruits in the country this past year for Oklahoma, and I think he's a guy that's going to be is going to be very very difficult to keep off the field. His size and his athleticism uh, is much greater than anyone else they have on campus from the defensive line. So I think when he gets to a point where he understands how to play football at this level, I think it's just going to be a matter of time before he gets more and more snaps. So we'll see how that continues to go. Big for him to be in here in the spring, to go through spring camp and obviously playing the spring game, and then that off season conditioning. He's already put on a bit of weight since he's been here. But I think he's just going to be too talented to keep off the field, Mark, in my opinion, early on. And the other freshman that may have an opportunity to get in the mix, we'll see is Derek LeBlanc. Again, he was a highly recruited, fairly highly recruited kid, top 35 overall defensive lineman in the country, and so he's a guy that actually started practicing with them in the bowl prep series. So that shows you a little bit how how eager he was to be on campus and things like that. So he's a guy that could make his way. Ashton Sanders is the other defensive lineman freshman commit, which he's probably destined for a red shirt, I would say, but obviously is in there and will have the opportunity to compete. So those are the freshmen coming in, and I think Mark, just in terms of in terms of guys that are coming back to this team, I think it probably starts with Ethan Downs. I think he has been a little bit, I don't know, and maybe unfairly maligned. I think the expectations were super super high, but led the team from a defensive lineman perspective. I know he's more of a defensive end, but just overall defensive line perspective. In tackles with 38, led in tackles for loss, tied with Reggie Grimes with sacks with 4.5. So he was probably the most, I think, was the most productive defensive lineman that Oklahoma has had and will have coming back. So it'll be interesting to see as that goes forward. And we talked about this a little bit on Saturday, Mark, that Oklahoma's defensive linemen were an area that were a position where there was not a lot of depth, especially on the end. So there was a lot of comfortability that even if you didn't perform maybe necessarily at your best, then it was going to be hard for you to be taken off the field. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily true this year, with the added depth that they've had through the transfer portal and through the recruiting cycle as well. So, but he's a guy that from a productivity perspective led last year. A few guys that have continued to be mentioned in some of these reports that you hear and some of the articles that are written about some of these kids that are really playing well, and really this is from some of the coaches' mouth as well. We mentioned Rondell Bothroyd, who's a guy that continues to get praised a little bit as well. Jonah Laulau is another guy who's a transfer in from Hawaii. Had come on a little bit towards the end of the year, played really well for Oklahoma in that bowl game against Florida State. So I think he's one that's really kind of come on and showed kind of what he's about, and being able to make that extra jump. R. Mason Thomas is another kid who has, from everything that I've heard, has made just a fantastic leap from where he was last year. He for those that you remember, he was a guy that Oklahoma got very, very late in the recruiting cycle last year. He was one of Miguel Chavis's first recruits last year in that short time when they got on campus. So he was a guy that played a little bit last year, was not incredibly effective, but he's a guy that's put on a lot of weight and has kind of learned the defense a lot more. And then Isaiah Coe is another guy, a defensive lineman who has continue. He's a senior. He's been here for a while. He's a JUCO transfer, but this will be his third year in the program. Obviously, second year in this defense. He's a guy that really gets talked up a lot. But I think probably Mark was interesting listening to Todd Bates a couple of days ago. The guy that he continues to rave about, and he's been a little bit banged up here over the spring, but Kelvin Gilliam is a guy that he has raved about over and over again. Spent a lot of time talking about him a couple of days ago in their media availability as a guy that continues to practice the way that you would expect practice. He's always a guy that you don't really have to tell anything twice to. A guy that he works things out in his head, as Todd Bates was referring to. You tell him something and you can tell that he's working it out and he's going through the motions, trying to improve kind of in between drills. So I think that's good. And then even a guy that Todd Bates is asking to work with some of the other defensive linemen while he's injured and while he's not able to be 100%. So I think, I think those guys are, and I think, you've got, as we'd mentioned, there's a couple of guys. Jordan Kelly had made a pretty good improvement last year. He's a guy that will be vying for a starting spot without a doubt in the internal side of the defensive line. And then Reggie Grimes is another guy that really started extremely strong last year. Had 3 or 4 sacks early on and really kind of disappeared to a certain degree. And so he's a guy that we'll see if he can continue to completely, if he in the second year in the defense, if he completely turns that around. But Mark, I think the one thing that has consistently resonated with me and with reports is that the size of this team, particularly on the defensive line, has continued to grow and grow and grow. I think the second year in the strength and conditioning program appears at this point has made a significant impact, at least on the surface level. Kind of watching what these kids look like, and I think you've got a lot of height in there among the defensive line as well. So obviously you still have to go do it, but I think they're starting to look a little bit more the part of a big time defense or an SEC style of defense now. Do they have the talent yet, or do they have the ability in just the second year in the program to turn it around in the way that they need to be?
Jason, you mentioned being a stats guy, and I am as well. So I always find some stats to be interesting or intriguing or lead me to question something because they're oddities. So the first one you brought up was, of course, the 8th ranking in the country, the 8th best tackles for loss statistic for 2022, as poorly as the defense measured out in just about everything else, especially in points per game and yards per game, total yards. Because if you understand the game, then you also understand a lot of these stats leads you to have certain information or knowledge about other things going on. So, for example, if you lead the country in sacks, a particular team has 45 or 50 sacks. That's usually somewhere near the top of the nation in sack totals. Well, you not only know that they had 50 sacks, you know that it would be the most ridiculous aberration ever if they just had 50 sacks and put no other pressure on the quarterback. That leads you to know that they're not only getting 50 sacks, they're getting close other times and probably putting more pressure or as much pressure as anybody in the country otherwise. So it would lead you to believe that they're extremely effective. Tackles for loss. So one thing this leads me to is the only 2 Power 5 teams ahead of them in tackles for loss. So I'm not going to speak to the other teams because I don't know their marginal group of 5 teams that ranked ahead of them. Penn State and Clemson, 2 extremely talented, effective defenses last year that just churned out, and we'll see them all over the NFL draft in 2 weeks. And Oklahoma's right there with them. And again, when you're getting tackles for loss, I'm not going to say this is as important as it might have been years ago, because we know that the level of passing offenses make it a, a greater possibility for teams to overcome a second and 13 than it used to be. But still, the statistics show that if you put a team behind the chains, that lowers greatly their ability to overcome that to get a first down. And if they're getting tackles for loss, well, if they're getting them on third down, that obviously takes them off the field. If they got them in first or second down, that's putting them in a favorable position for third down. So I got to think that their third down conversion rate is awful defensively, and I got to think that they're giving up a ton of big plays. That's rather obvious. They did. So I just found that statistic intriguing because it's just an oddity to rank that high in tackles for loss and not be a good defense, first and foremost. So
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and that's why I kind of wanted to to preface that by putting multiple categories together. Because if you look at that, I mean, you're exactly right. If you just look at that and you don't look at anything else, you're thinking, how in the world could this defense be as bad as it was last year with having with ranking that high in tackles for loss? But I think there's a couple of things, Mark. I think it lends to kind of the inconsistency that we saw out of this defense, really kind of from play to play. Because to your point that you mentioned on third down conversion, yes, Oklahoma was number 5 in the country with I think right at 8.8 tackles per loss per game, but third down conversions they gave up 41% of the first down, 41% of their third down attempts. So, and that made for about 88th in the country. So when you put those together, yeah, there was tons of big plays. And I think probably the other thing is, we talked a little bit about sacks, and Oklahoma was sort of in the middle of the pack, number 64 ranked overall, but they had 28 sacks on the season. But I think the style of defense that Brent Venables plays is lends itself to they have to sack the quarterback much more than what they did last year, because they are extremely aggressive. So if they're not getting to the quarterback, or at least making the quarterback make quick decisions or bad reads or a lot of quarterback hurries, then they're not being as effective as they need to, because because of those big plays. And I mean, as well as I do, I mean, when you look at the defensive line, I mean, that really controls a lot for the defense, whether it's the rushing defense, certainly. But they have an active component within the passing yards allowed as well, because if they're not getting any pressure, it's going to be hard to cover these receivers for 5, 6, 7 seconds. As athletic as they are in Oklahoma, and I'd mentioned that 119 out of 131 from a passing yards allowed perspective, almost 274 yards per game. And then, like I said, rushing or in 106. So in those two major components, I mean, you can make what you will about yards. I'm more concerned about, from my perspective, points. How many points you allow? Yeah, if you, in this day and age, most teams, I'm saying outside of like Georgia, consistently outside of even Alabama to a certain degree, but there's a bend but not break mentality that is present on the defensive side of the ball. So it's yeah, if you give up 450 yards, but what do you do in the red zone? What do you do in terms of points allowed? And Oklahoma was 30 points per game. But again, in the red zone, number 88 out of 131. So still they're very much in the lower half of a lot of these statistics that really make sense to me and really mean a lot in terms of what's your ability to get off the field. Even if you're struggling, giving up some yards and some first downs, can you get off the field when it counts? And it just wasn't enough consistently, as I'd mentioned. Giving up 30 points per game is just not where you need to be for a big time school.
And that third down conversion rate is actually the way I look at it, if this makes sense, is even worse than what it's showing because of this. Again, 104 tackles for loss means that 30 or 40 of those came on third down. So you're off the field there on those. And the other third probably came on second down, the other third on first down. And you're putting those teams behind the chains, and you still gave up a first down a large percent of the time, even though the odds were in your favor. So that's really poor third down defense out of Oklahoma there. The other stat that jumped out at me is one of the odd plays in football that I enjoy is just your batted pass at the line. I love seeing defensive linemen bat a pass back in the quarterback's face. And I noticed that the Oklahoma State transfer, if I can find his stats right here, he got you had noted that he had some issues. Trace Ford had some issues staying on the field last year. And so he's a defensive lineman. So the passes defense statistic, if you're a defensive back, those are thrown balls downfield that you're breaking up. But if you're at the line, I can almost guarantee 5 of those, if not all of them, were him batting the pass at the line. And so for him to have not played that much and been fairly, I don't want to say ineffective, because again, I don't want to make an evaluation on something I didn't see. And I watched Oklahoma State probably play 5 times, but I wasn't watching Trace Ford on every play to see how effective he was. But he had 6 batted passes at the line. So that's just kind of interesting to me. So it's obviously something he does well.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's a big component of it. To your point, if you're not able to get to the quarterback, you need to do everything that you can to, get in the quarterback's line of vision. If you're not able to bat that pass down, and there's been a couple of comments around this, which I absolutely agree with, related to, and we kind of alluded to this earlier in terms of Oklahoma not necessarily being as deep of a team on the defensive side of the ball as as you would like, not as much depth. So I think a product of how bad this team was really the fatigue that they faced later, specifically later on in games and later on in the year. And I know that me and you had talked several times about this in terms of the strength and conditioning program that Oklahoma had last year. A lot of these kids weren't used to it. And it could have worn down their bodies a little bit more than they were were expecting to. And so you have to think, Mark, and being in the second year of this system, whether it be the on the field or the strength and conditioning side of things, on top of having a little bit more depth at these positions, particularly on the defensive line, that in itself has an opportunity to lend to a little bit more improvement, this year. But obviously that remains to be seen. But that's a good point, just in terms of the lack of, kind of lack of depth that Oklahoma had at key positions last year.
Some fans watching us will roll their eyes when I make this comment. Others will be amused by it, but I'll just throw it in there because we do a USC show on Monday night. And I just noted when we were talking strength and conditioning over there that the last few games of USC's season against Utah and Tulane's not for as really good as they were last year. They're not exactly trouting out 5 stars and, physical specimens that USC, my goodness, you talk about a program that needs some strength and conditioning upgrade. And I actually challenged some USC folks on there to say Lincoln Riley really needs to prove that he can develop a program that is strong in strength and conditioning, because watching that defense down the stretch last year, they looked like a bunch of middle school kids trying to tackle people down the stretch. It was awful. It was really bad.
Yeah.
So it's at the core of the program. It's extremely important.
It is. No, I think it is. And I think, a lot of, I saw this on social media, and it was kind of funny to and I know Oklahoma fans were in no position last year to brag or boast or even, talk a little bit of friendly trash to USC. But I saw so many tweets and things like that where USC fans were saying, well, I guess all these Oklahoma fans were right, telling us how bad this defense was, against really solid, quality opponents. And yeah, that's Lincoln Riley's mo. His mo is he's believed this, and I don't know, if there's going to be something or what there will be that's going to help change his mind, but his mo has been to just have a decent defense, maybe to force a few turnovers here and there, and just enough where they can outscore the other team. And I think that they got the benefit of the doubt early on in the year, Mark, because they were forcing a ton of turnovers. Now the problem is when you don't force turnovers, then that starts to come back to bite you. And so, and I just chuckle a little bit. I saw that they're adding Cliff Kingsbury. So, but I don't know that and I don't follow it obviously.
He doesn't coach defense, does he?
No, not to my
Yeah, okay.
knowledge. But to my knowledge, they haven't done anything on the defensive side of the ball in terms of different, any kind of different coaches. I know Alex Grinch is there, but I think they've maintained the same staff that they have in the past. So, I don't know, Mark. It'll be interesting. And I'm trying to remember. They've got a really tough game week 1, early on in the year. Don't they play? Is it LSU that they face in week 1 of the season?
No. Who do they play out of conference? Why don't I have that at the top of my head? They actually play a week 0 game against, San Jose State or somebody of that ilk. USC.
I thought I saw something. I'm trying to look at the schedule.
They of course have Notre Dame later in the season. Yeah, I can't recall them having anybody else that they have to play outside the conference.
I'll look that up real quick here while we're talking.
And you wonder, and we'll steer it back to Oklahoma, but you also wonder, with them moving to the Big Ten, that will be fascinating to watch, because certainly I'm not saying that the Big Ten's going to beat them up or anything like that, because USC is certainly going to be a hefty challenge for just about everybody in the Big Ten to deal with, from a certain standpoint. But running into, regardless of how good they are, whether they have a good team that year or not, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, we're not even talking about the better teams in the Big Ten. They're still going to punch you in the mouth and maybe play a little bit different football than what USC's been playing in the Pac-12.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it was, and it was my mistake. I was thinking I had saw something. It was 2024 where they're opening up with LSU. But you're right. Week 0, they host San Jose State. So they don't really have too much of a non-conference schedule outside of going to Notre Dame.
Yeah, so that's interesting for 2024 that they've got LSU on the docket in a season in which they're going to start running into, not necessarily all of them at the same time, but Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State on down the line.
Yep.
All right. Well, we've got Ryan here, and he is asking and saying that Venables likes to use the 3-man front at times, but I don't think we have anyone that can hold down the nose effectively.
Yeah, I agree. I think, potentially Jacob Lacey could be that guy. I don't know that. I don't know if Isaiah Coe is quite big enough to be able to do that, but no, he's right. I don't know that we have anyone to be able to do that, because he's absolutely right. He likes a 3-man line, and he likes to be able to, to bring some of that pressure off the edge, whether it be from the cheetah position or bring linebackers or things like that. And he changed the way he called the defense a little bit, because he's traditionally, I think from being at OU previously and then Clemson, he prides himself on the number of sacks that they get, being able to get to the quarterback, and that really wasn't something that he was able to do. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that he feels confident in someone at the nose, whether that's Jacob Lacey or Isaiah Coe, or even Kelly in there as well. But I think that's there's still a little bit away from that. So they probably don't have anyone that they feel comfortable with at this point to be able to do that consistently.
Ryan also asking here, who do you think is going to be the most probable to be a real difference maker?
So on the defensive front, I think Rondell Bothroyd, I think, is the guy that has an opportunity to be a difference maker. They are raving about R. Mason Thomas, so that continues to be. Those are the two guys I think, just in terms of being able to get to the quarterback, is another guy. Now I think the big wild card is going to be Trace Ford. If he's healthy, if he's anywhere near 100%, I think he has an opportunity to potentially be a difference maker on the defensive line. And so, and then you also worry. I mean, Ethan Downs is another guy. Does he get lost in the shuffle a little bit? What does his improvement look like from a defensive lineman perspective? As we mentioned earlier, he was the most productive defensive lineman, consistently throughout the year in terms of his ability to get to the quarterback and his tackles for loss, just tackles overall. I think he led the team with 9 quarterback hurries. So I think he had. I don't know that he's necessarily a difference maker. I think he is going to be one that will thrive on other people's ability to rush the quarterback, and him kind of being in some of these one-on-one battles and not be really required to be that number one guy, so to speak.
Folks, we've got a Discord link. Had a couple people sign up just in the last 24 hours. We hope that you're the next one. You can talk Sooners all the time, talk college football all the time. We've got various channels there, which are just basically different chat rooms that you can talk college football. So you can sign up at Mark Rogers TV on Patreon. So go to patreon.com, search Mark Rogers TV, and join the Discord. And you get other Patreon benefits in regards to exclusive content, predictions, and all of that good stuff as well. Anything on the recruiting front going on?
No, I mean, like I said, the outside of the commitment that they got last week from Michael Hawkins, there's not a whole lot. Oklahoma was in the running for a linebacker last night, Peyton Pierce, who did not go to make his commitment to Oklahoma. Sammy Brown, as we talked a little bit about him, he's the guy that Oklahoma's really in on from a linebacker perspective. I think getting him would be really, can't really undersell that how big that would be kind of for the linebacker recruitment. But as we mentioned, this will the strategy that Oklahoma has from a recruiting perspective is always going to be a cause for concern. I think they're ranked number 51 right now in the 2024 class. Ironically, right below Texas, I think at 50. Either that or it's vice versa. But I think Oklahoma will continue to get some of these guys, later on in the recruiting cycle, whether it be later on in the summer, because they want guys that obviously want to be committed here and don't want to take visits. So David Stone's another one. I don't know, Mark. Some of these kids, they play the game, and it's just, I think Oklahoma leads by probably a fairly considerable margin at this point, but he loves the recruiting game. Let's just say that he loves the attention that he's getting from all the different fan bases. And so, I mean, I still think so. Gerald McCoy has been a guy that has been recruiting this guy on his own. Just obviously he's not coaching for Oklahoma, but he's a guy that has been very public, just kind of trying to reach out to him and on Twitter and getting him. So I think like I said, he's playing the game, but I think he's Oklahoma's certainly the favorite, if not the prohibitive favorite at this point. So that would be obviously a big time get. One of the best players in the country, one of the best defensive linemen in the country in this 2024 cycle. So yeah, it remains to be seen, but it'll get cranked up here. I think a little bit more like last year in the June and July timeframe.
Folks, we could benefit you if you sponsor here at the Voice of College Football, whether that's you individually with a personal sponsorship, or if you have a business or are in contact with a business, please hit me up at MarkRogersTV at Gmail, MarkRogersTV at Gmail, to find out more. We're here every week with Jason. Typically on Wednesday. This is our usual spot here Wednesday at 11:30 Central Time. But of course, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notifications to know when we go live. Jason popped on last night with a softball preview for the LSU game. Did the same thing last week. So you'll be locked in on that. And also, if we need to change up in any particular week in terms of our Sooners Live football show with the spring game coming up a week from Saturday. All right, Jason, anything else out there you wanted to hit on?
No, I don't think so. Maybe we can, maybe next week we can combine efforts and go linebacker and defensive backs ahead of the spring game, so we could double that up just to make sure we got everything covered, so everybody's ready for the spring game next Saturday.
Absolutely. All right, everyone, make it on back here next week. We'll preview the spring game, look at linebackers and DBs on OU Sooners Live. Jason, we always appreciate you breaking things down for us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me as always.